Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us on Simsbury Community Television for our third presentation of the historical awareness of race. My name is Lloyd Huey, and I'll be one of your presenters here tonight. We want to thank you for joining us, and we'd like to thank the Spirit Council for their effort in organizing and planning this. Specifically, would like to also thank co-chairs Nicole Kodak and Cheryl Cook for their tremendous effort in working with us in getting this done. Also would like to thank the Simsbury Public Library for their support in providing us with the facilities and the resources to get this done, specifically Lindsay Neffinger and Chris Carney. Special thanks to Simsbury Community Television, and those watching, we want to thank you for joining us, but also special thanks to our station manager, Patrick Fallon, and also our managing the whole process tonight is Anitra Powers. Thank you for joining us. Just also want to remind you that next week, or inform you that next week, we will be doing this presentation, but we will be doing it on Zoom. So we ask that you register at the library events calendar, and they will send you the link so that you can join us for that event next Wednesday at the same time. So again, thank you for joining us. And at this time, I will turn it over to Carol Flanagan, who will be presenting to you. Carol?
Thank you, Lloyd.
My pleasure.
Thanks very much. We would like to begin by acknowledging that the land that is now the town of Simsbury on which we gather is the territory of the Weetag and Massacre peoples who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. We further recognize the Weetag Massacre peoples' migration to Salisbury, Connecticut alongside other Tungus tribes at the end of Metacom's rebellion. The Wetanook, Pequot, Putatuk, Tungus, and Mohegan peoples came together along the Housatonic River, creating the contemporary Scatucook Nation. We thank them for their strength and resilience in protecting this land and aspire to uphold our responsibilities according to their example. As this country grows more diverse and more authentically aware of how deeply racism is embedded in our history, no one can take whiteness for granted. Being white isn't a baseline or a default position for being American. It's just merely one identity among many. Throughout this country, from online racist communities to academia to everyday discourse on television, conversations around the dinner table, people are groping for an understanding of what it means to be white, including what it used to mean historically, which we're going to get into tonight, and also what it could mean for a better, more enlightened society. We look into our past to find ourselves, for confirmation of who we are, and we celebrate that. We have moments where we gather on certain days. Think of the 4th of July. We also have places that we gather, and places carry heavy symbolic meaning. I grew up right next to Plymouth, Massachusetts. It's a tourist haven, but it's also a very special place where people come to find the replica of the Mayflower that brought the Pilgrims over, to see Plymouth Rock. As Malcolm X famously said in the 60s, we didn't land on Plymouth Rock landed on us. It's a huge rock, But it's celebrated. See this incredible, I'm going to try and do my little thingy here. This is an incredible structure, and it's down on the water's edge, and underneath, which a rock doesn't really need protection, but it's celebrating Plymouth Rock. This statue here, this magnificent statue, okay, now it's not working, is Massasoit, who was the sachem of the Wampanoag tribe when the Mayflower arrived in Plymouth. It actually first came to Cape Cod, but then it ended up in Plymouth. Here's a front picture of this magnificent bronze statue. That is at the top of the hill, looking, which I like, looking down on Plymouth Rock and out over the water, Plymouth Harbor, where the Mayflower would have come in. And this is also in the same location, a little further up on the hill. And as a result, in many ways, of the Indigenous people's protest on the day of the 350th anniversary of the Pilgrims arriving in 1620. So in 1970, I'm going to go back here, Frank James, his Indian name was Wamsutta, which was one of the sons of Massasoit in real history. Frank James, was the chief of the Wampanoag people, and he wrote a speech that he wanted to deliver at the 350th anniversary of the arrival of the Mayflower in Plymouth. And it was protesting, as this says, the long history of atrocities committed by white settlers on his people. And he was told that he could not deliver this speech. It was suppressed because the tone was wrong. It was angry, it was not celebratory. So he delivered it anyway, not at the ceremony, but elsewhere. And I am going to read you just an excerpt of this. It was a longer speech. This is by Frank James. It is with mixed emotion that I stand here to share my thoughts. This is a time of celebration for you, celebrating an anniversary of a beginning of the white men in America. A time of looking back, of reflection. It is with a heavy heart that I took back upon when I think what happened to my people. History wants us to believe that the Indian was a savage, illiterate, uncivilized animal. A history that was written by an organized, disciplined people to expose us as an unorganized and undisciplined entity. Two distinctly different cultures met. One thought they must control life. The other believed life was to be enjoyed because nature decreed it. Let us remember the Indian is and was as human as the white man. And now what happens is that every Thanksgiving, in this spot where Massasoit stands, is a national day of mourning, and many Indigenous peoples gather on Thanksgiving Day and make speeches, and as it's explained here, this is a validation of what they feel. It's a validation of the history that they claim happened to them, of which they are a part, but their voices have not been listened to. So if you can imagine what had to happen for this plaque to be put in Plymouth, next to Massasoit, next to Plymouth Rock, this is a complete validation of the history and of the damage and genocide that was perpetrated on Indigenous people. It's impossible to give you more than just a fraction of the history of Indigenous peoples in North America. And so I've made some choices, but I would like to say that if you go to the resources that we are going to publish for this, for Indigenous peoples' history, you will find much more detail on what I'm going to talk about tonight, but you will also find a whole host of other events, of other tribes, of stories, narratives, and you should feel free to navigate your way through these. Pick one up, put it down, pick up another, and please, if you find something in your research or your reading that is not on that list and you think it should be, please get in touch with us. We would be very excited to add even more resources to the list. I'm going to talk briefly about a really important, and you'll see why I'm going to do this because this comes up to the present, about the Pequot War that happened primarily in Connecticut and Rhode Island in 1637. Why go back that far? Because it has relevance today. This is a drawing of, and it's a primary document, so it's from the I don't even know if it's the 30s or 40s or 50s, but it's in that general range. This is the inside of this massive fort that the Pequots had, like a giant, giant, giant wigwam, huge. Hundreds and hundreds of people could be housed in it, plus their food supply. And there was a war that broke out between the colonists and the Pequots, but there was also trouble and tension between the Pequots and other area tribes over the rights and, I would say, monopoly of the fur trade. And so the fur trade was very lucrative, and there were all kinds of players vying and competing for control of that. And so tensions were high, and the Pequots were, they were relatively warlike. The other tribes in the area were kind of afraid of them. And some little skirmishes broke out, and it turns out that a few white settlers were killed and at the hands of the Pequot. And so there was going to be this huge reaction. And there was a guy named John Mason, who was a very experienced military leader. He led they made the decision that they were going to attack this fort, this stronghold, this Pequot stronghold, that, by the way, was not just warriors, but women and children inside this fort. And the decision was made to attack at dawn. Now, the construction of this fort was designed to make sure that the Pequot people would not be able to be surprised and overwhelmed by enemies. So they made the doors to the fort very small. So you couldn't have a bunch of people come in and surprise you. That ended up working tragically against the Pequots, because one of the things that happened is that the fort was set afire. So there was this blaze, and the tinder went up, and so all of these people inside were going to burn to death if they didn't escape. So there was this huge push to escape through these very narrow openings, which had been designed to keep them safe, and not all the people could get out through the doors. So many of them burned alive, and the ones that did come out, the colonists were just there waiting and just picking them off. The colonists had also allied themselves with the Narragansett tribe for now and again, and so the Narragansett were there as part of this attack on the Pequots, because the Narragansett had a quarrel with the Pequots too. And in the primary documents, the Narragansett are commenting on the bloodthirsty nature of the colonists in this battle. So there is a statue that was made, a 9-foot, really magnificent sculpture of John Mason. And it was, in a period of time in our history, in the late 19th century, was sort of this nationalist expression of famous people and events, and many, many, many statues were commissioned at that time. So in that time, John Mason's statue was erected in Mystic on the site, which at the time you could still kind of tell where the foundations of that Pequot fort were. So it was put right on top of the fort. And there's a plaque celebrating his heroism and his bravery and his leadership in that important battle where the Pequots were almost completely wiped out. Then in 1995, it was removed from that site because of the power that the Mashantucket Pequots had in the 90s, and they continue today. They had a very successful tribe. I'm sure many of you might have been to Mohegan Sun. Some of you, hopefully, if you haven't, you will now visit the Pequot Museum. They had enough wealth and political capital to be able to have a museum and research center where they are the ones telling their story. Very, very significant. And then, so it was removed and relocated to the Green in Windsor. Why? Because the Pequots wanted it off of their sacred ground and they had the clout to make that happen. But also because John Mason was from Windsor. He was one of the co-founders of the town. And so they moved the statue, where it still is, to a green in Windsor off the back, the main drag. Interestingly enough, the story's not over about where the statue should be. In 2020, the Town Council of Windsor, this is after a lot of contentious debate about whether the statue should stay where it is or be moved inside the fence for the Windsor Historical Society. There was one petition that had 600 signatures explaining why the statue had to be moved to be safe, to be protected, and I'll show you why in a minute, but also as an artifact, so saved so that people could study it. And then there was another petition, didn't have 600 signatures, but it had hundreds, saying, no way. Here's something that happened in 1630. Are you kidding me? And now you're going to move it and it was going to cost $250,000 at the taxpayer's expense. So there's two conflicting sides, and it was more complicated than that. I don't mean to make light of this. There were many, many complicated reasons why people wanted or didn't want it to be moved. But there was a lot of pressure on the town council, and so in 2020, they finally voted, and they voted 5-4 to move it to the grounds of the Windsor Historical Society. Here's the statue when it was first erected on the site of the fort in Mystic, and all these gentlemen are looking pretty satisfied with the erection of that statue. I'm going to show you a close-up of the face. Very, right? And here's a picture of the statue in Windsor on the green. Notice the red. So this was, they assumed this was a protest, nobody laid claim to it, that this is blood on the, hands, so to speak, of John Mason, Pequot blood. On the bottom of the, what I really am interested in the bottoms of statues, there are usually 4 sides, and so there's the history being told as you go around. So the first side that he's facing is the story about how brave he was, that was put there in 1887. And then on the side away from that is an explanation written by the Mashantucket Pequots of why, when, and why this statue was removed from sacred ground and put in Windsor. I don't know if they're going to do a third one for moving it to the Historical Society or not. So I just wanted to show, here's an inside shot of the Mohegan Sun to show how really the Mashantucket Pequot have been incredibly successful in their endeavors. And I mean, this is like, people, huge singers and bands, and it's a really important place. It's not just a casino and a hotel to die for. And here's the Pequot Museum that I mentioned. I mean, I think almost every grade in elementary school in this area has had a trip to the Pequot Museum. So many of you who have been watching, and maybe if you're just tuning in for the first time, it's so great, thank you. we have each time put a Google form out there for a response by you. And so the question this time is, should the statue of Captain John Mason be kept? And it says a little description there, in case you aren't watching, but you tell someone else to go think about it. If not, what should happen to the statue? I mean, there's a whole range of things that could happen to the statue, right? And if so, if it should be kept, where should it be kept? And you should try to explain why. And clearly this is relevant not just for the John Mason statue, but in our country today, there's a lot of very good debate, and some of it very contentious, about what should be done with, for instance, Confederate statues from the Civil War. It's not just statues, but monuments. Where should they be located? Should they be moved all to one museum? Should they be destroyed? Should they be put in the basement someplace? Should they remain where they are? And there's no easy answer to these questions. Several universities have been examining very openly in a very transparent way their ties to the institution of slavery. Two that just come to mind quickly that I was looking at their websites are Brown University in Providence and Yale in New Haven. And they're attempting to have very honest discussions and exposing their history. It's interesting that when the statue was first moved of John Mason from Mystic to Windsor, that Dr. Kevin McBride, who is the director of research at the Pequot Museum, he remembers that when the statue was removed in the 1990s, and this is a quote, "If you take it down," he said, "no one will remember what happened here." Now that's a different view. I know I read something about a survivor of the Holocaust saying a similar thing. If you remove the signs that that genocide was in place, how are people going to remember? Where will they go to remember it? And so I thought that was another interesting thing. So here's from the point of view of the people that wanted it moved off of sacred ground saying, yeah, but you know what? It's really important that people remember this. So that's just another point of view. I'm going to switch now and talk about another this is a really dark chapter in our history, as the name suggests, Trail of Tears. This happened primarily, it started in 1831, but it goes on for decades. And the evidence from military records as well as other records suggests that 100,000 indigenous people were removed from their homes and forced to march west to, as it turns out, to Oklahoma. This was done because it was perfectly legal to do it. The Indian Removal Act was passed in 1830. Now, an interesting story. Let's see if I've got Andy Jackson here. Yes. Okay, being transparent that he is not one of my favorite presidents. And it's because of the Trail of Tears, but it's also because he did some good things. But I'm sure you know about how the government is organized. There are three branches. There's the executive branch, which is the president. There is the legislative branch, which is Congress, which is where laws are made. And then there is the Supreme Court, the judicial branch. And the Supreme Court's job, it doesn't make laws, it judges the constitutionality of laws. And so it's interesting that the Cherokee they learned the law, the white man's law, and they brought forward cases to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court agreed to hear them, and they made two decisions where they said, you can't just take their land. And Andrew Jackson, I'm paraphrasing, said something to the effect of, so the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was John Marshall, and So Andrew Jackson said, let Marshall come down here and enforce his decision. And then the Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, so ignoring the Supreme Court's decision that this was not something that they would be allowed to do with respect to the Constitution. This is the route that they took. So I don't know if you can see this. The dotted line is the land route of the Forced March. The one that goes around and it's solid is a water route. I didn't know about that until I started going back over this. I thought it was just by land. And then the other one, they have other routes. The green is another route. But here they are headed for Oklahoma from the southeast. So this was a complete removal of all of the tribes. What was the motive? Land. It's almost always land. There was this incredible greed, which is not too strong a word. You will find it everywhere in the accounts of this time period, from the beginning of our nation all the way up until, the early 1900s. The expansion, the hunger for land, and the movement of white people west was, it felt like it couldn't be stopped. There were no photographs of the, in the 1830s. So this is a painting, I'm sorry, the resolution isn't very good, of the Trail of Tears. So you could just see this massive movement of people and the crying woman, the tears in the front. So I started talking about this. Westward Expansion, I think that there are a lot of us that think of that in a very positive way. It was exciting. You have wagon trains of people. There's been movies and stories written about them. There are lots of primary accounts, diaries that talk about how hard it was, but how excited people were. But it's really important to understand that this was done at the expense of people, tribes that were on this land. These were tribal lands that were stolen, treaties were made and treaties were broken. And it was really, the westward expansion was happening faster and faster and faster and faster. And then you have the gold rush in 1849, and people swept across the country trying to get to California. So nothing seemed to stop it, no matter what policy was put in place. And there were some good intentioned policies. But the result, and I love the word relentless cycle of invasion, resistance, and defeat. So there was resistance, but it pretty much always ended in defeat. And Indigenous people were faced with the stark choice: acculturation, removal, or extinction. Acculturation, removal, extinction. Tribes, within tribes, they split between people that wanted to accommodate the white man, do what they could to not be, right? Or traditionalists. And many traditionalists would embrace a going back to the way it was before the white man was, and many of them were very motivated by rebelling. So there were many movements of rebellion where tribes even got together that wouldn't normally have. One example is Pontiac's rebellion at the end of the French and Indian War in 1763. It was almost like a stalemate, but ultimately they were defeated. I'm going to talk to you about, and this is related to westward expansion, the Dawes Act, which was passed in 1887, really important piece of legislation. So initially, the reason that it ended up being passed was there were a lot of reformers wanting to better society. They had been very active in the abolitionist movement. Many of them were women, and they were Christian women, and Christianity was at the heart of their desire to reform and make society a better place. So there was one reformer named Helen Hunt Jackson, and she wrote a series of essays that ended up being published and was widely read, and it was called A Century of Dishonor. And many people in Congress read it, and Senator Dawes read it, and they were very moved by her account of the horrible treatment of Indigenous people at the hands of the white settlers and the government. So, and often reformers look to government to make sure that what they think should happen, happens. So reformers tend to look to the government to make policies. The Dawes Act, the solution that they, and it has several parts, came up with was they needed to assimilate the tribes. They needed to have them learn to be more like Americans. They couldn't be Americans, but to be more like them, to be productive members of society, you know, at a lower level. And they would need to shed, literally, their clothing. They would have to get rid of their customs, their traditions. They would have to reject everything Indian or everything Sioux, Lakota Sioux, to embrace this model, to assimilate. One of the ways that they would do this was converting. You need to convert to Christianity. And we are going to, and I'm sure some of you might have heard of this, send your children to boarding schools. And recently in the news, right, there's been a discovery of mass graves at some of these boarding schools in Canada. And this has been horrifying to learn about right now. So this is timely. I teach at a boarding school, and I remember in the late 90s or right around 2000, 2 girls came to school from the Mohawk Reserve up on the border of Canada and the United States. And one of the girls, her grandmother, who was elderly, was sobbing because she was thinking about boarding schools that were cutting the hair of the boys and putting them in starched suits and not letting them speak their native language. And she thought of it as more of a prison type of thing. The other thing that the Dawes Act did is it decided, or people decided, that the gender, it was like the genders were mixed up. They had the men doing squaws work and they had the women doing other stuff, and they wanted it to mirror or to be parallel with what they felt were proper gender roles. And so they had land allotments, and this, by the way, certainly at work was a motive to disrupt tribal loyalty and to gain access to land. But they gave different size allotments of land to who they determined was the head of the family. Well, the Indigenous people didn't have like nuclear families with heads of families. So, and the notion of private property, like you could own this parcel of land. So immediately what happened, and they were intent on doing this so that the men would be farmers and they would hunt on their property, right? But what happened is that land speculators took enormous advantage of this and bought for a fraction of the value of the land. They would buy the land or trick people out of it. So you can imagine this is not going to go well. I'm sorry again for the resolution here, but this is to me so heartbreaking. Here are these Indian boys, and then here they are posing for a picture after their hair had been shorn and their clothing removed, and they're in white man's clothes. There are several pictures like this so these are the results. And I don't want to read all of it to you. You can see it. But to lose 60% of your tribal land is huge, right? So one of the things that the Indigenous people were always worried about from the time of King Philip, Metacom, in the 1600s until the early 20th century was their loss of tribal land. In some cases, they were removed, like the Trail of Tears, and it was just taken. In other cases, they were put on reservations, and those reservations got smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. But 60% of their tribal land was lost, ultimately, as a result of the Dawes Act, and in the next 40 years. And the government policies around this were not reversed until 1934. And even then, it didn't really work well to reverse any of the damage that had been done. And the majority of the tribes were reduced to numbers so low that they couldn't even maintain a collective resistance to this. Now, there are certainly stories of survival. In some cases, I've just highlighted 3 tribes here. The Cheyenne became expert horse traders. And so they were able to that was a business for them, and they were highly respected, and that worked for them. The Navajo turned to crafts for survival. So they were making blankets and beaded items, and people would buy those. One of the things, though, is they got sucked into the market economy, and they'd been used to a subsistence level economy, and that, again, it sort of put them in debt and underneath and dependent on the larger markets. But still, they had this that they could turn to. And the Hopi, who had been surviving, like hanging onto sides of cliffs in the desert, there was a lot of publicity about the threats to their tribe and their culture. And so with some of the help with influential whites, they were also able to fend off threats. Okay, here's another event. So I know I've kind of jumped around, and it sounds like the story starts to sound very similar. Wounded Knee was a massacre, another massacre in 1890. This picture here is of a cavalryman in a field. It was December, and that white is actually snow. And so there were bodies of indigenous people all over the ground when this was over. It didn't actually take long. The Lakota Sioux were being moved by the cavalry from one location to another, and they had, as far as they knew, they had disarmed all the Indians. And the man who wrote an account that a lot of people looked to understand what happened, who was from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Mooney was his last name, said that a shot was fired. And so a shot was fired among where the Indians were, and then all hell broke loose. And the soldiers just opened, and they were afraid anyway. There were circumstances that had created a lot of tension between settlers and the cavalry and the indigenous people who had started a millenaristic movement called the Ghost Dance religion. And they would wear white shirts. So a millenaristic religious movement is one that looks beyond life here to a better life beyond. And so and it grows out of times of extreme oppression. So they would wear these white shirts and there are pictures of this, that they said were bulletproof. Like you could shoot them when they had their shirt on, and it wouldn't hurt them. And they would dance and they would sing, and the whole thing was very scary looking to the white settlers. So there was already this tension. And so when the firing broke out, it didn't last very long, and people were running away, and they were being shot and mowed down until everybody was dead. This is a famous picture of one dead man in the snow. I'm just going to leave it there for a second. Here's a picture of bodies being loaded in a wagon where they took them this was on the Pine Ridge Reservation, and they took them in to this sort of eating area, and they just had bodies lying on tables. It was hard to dig a mass grave when the ground was frozen, almost frozen. This is 1973. It is at Wounded Knee. And in the 60s, if anyone's as old as me out there, in the late 60s and early 70s, it was a time of, some books call it the politics of identity, but there were different groups that formed and really in many ways piggybacked on the African American civil rights movement, using a lot of the same strategies to be recognized, to have their voices heard, and to make demands. The AIM, the American Indian Movement, formed at this time, and there were two things that I remember. This is a protest at Wounded Knee, and look at the response by the government. They asked them to leave. They said, we aren't going to leave. So they brought tanks, and nobody was killed. And then they also, the American Indian Movement, occupied Alcatraz. So this prison, this island out in San Francisco Bay. And if you go on YouTube, there are so many different speeches that you can hear people making. One of the people that was here at Wounded Knee is a guy named Russell Means, who reported to Congress very eloquently and began his speech in a native language that no one could understand, and then he translated that. But you'll recognize him because he's an actor, he's an amazing actor, and almost every film that you see that has a major player who is Indian, who is indigenous, Russell Means will have that role. He was in Michael Mann's Last of the Mohegans, for instance. I'm going to talk just a little bit about another thing that was going on at the same time. So in the 19th century, in a very race-conscious America, as the Indian became no longer a threat, one of the things that started happening is artists, photographers, painters, sculptors thought, oh, we better capture this moment. It's dying, these people are dying out and there will be nothing left. So there was almost like collecting. And so this painting is by, both of these paintings, and there are a whole bunch that he did by an artist named George Catlin, who was in Litchfield, Connecticut in law school. There was a law school, the Tapping Reeve Law School, and he learned to be a lawyer, and he went back to Pennsylvania, hated being a lawyer, and wrote about it, and wanted just to be an artist. And he also wanted to go west and to paint, while they still were there, the indigenous people. So there are many, many paintings that he did. Also, these are not paintings, these are photographs. Curtis, you can go on and there are pages and pages of stunning photographs by him of indigenous people. And they look so dignified, so quiet, and so, I should have practiced words that I would say, but they're dying out. So it's like a dying breed that he is recording for posterity or something like that. So there's this incredible romanticizing of the noble savage, once the noble savage is not any kind of a threat anymore. And then, of course, there's Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. I don't know if you've heard about this or not, which was in the very end of the 19th century, where, Buffalo, very, very smart. There was this fascination in the East of the West, like the cowboys and Indians and danger, and daring. So this Wild West show was brought east to the people that were hungry for this. And it was very much myth-making for the whole nation. And I don't know if you've heard of Annie Oakley, but you can go on YouTube and there's actually, I had no idea they had film then. You can watch her sharpshooting. And then there were staged battles between indigenous people and white settlers, and real indigenous people were in this play about themselves, and they would lose the battle every night. And so I think if you're interested in that, there's an awful lot that you can read about the Wild West show. And then there's the Hollywood Indian. So it says here too that there was this alternating portrayal. It wasn't just all Indians whooping and screaming with tomahawks coming down off of a ridge to scalp and kill the white woman and children. In fact, there were a lot of portrayals in film of very noble Indians who were they were helping. In some cases, they were actually helping white people. In other cases, they were just speaking for their whole tribe, and it was a sad reality that they were facing. And so I'm going to show you. This first one is so this is The Searchers, and this is Natalie Wood, and she's worse. In the movie, it's like she's worse than being an Indian because she was a white girl that was kidnapped by the Indians and becomes an Indian. She has a husband who is an Indian, and it's a John Wayne film, and it's actually a really interesting film about race, consciously. It's a John Ford film about race, and you should, The Searchers, I'll put it in the resources. But that's Natalie Wood. I don't know if you recognize this, Charlton Heston. And so, he's obviously not an indigenous person, but he would play, the movie's called The Savage, and he wears heavy makeup to show that he's not white. Here is, what's the name of the guy? Jeff Chandler, who plays Cochise. And this was a very big film. And he's just wearing a lot of really heavy brown makeup. That's a dark picture, sorry. Here's a show that was incredibly popular, The Lone Ranger. This wasn't a film, this was a TV show. And interestingly enough, the Indian sidekick for The Lone Ranger was actually an indigenous man, Jay Silverheels. And so I haven't really started, I'm really eager to go back and research to see if there was some, subversive element going on, because this was supposed to be it was a little bit campy. But this was Tonto. The Lone Ranger was always masked, and Tonto called the Lone Ranger Kimosabe, which actually translated means the one who doesn't understand. So that couldn't be a mistake, right? I don't know. Okay, so sadly, Indigenous history is a long history of broken treaties, broken promises, the theft of tribal lands, intentional destruction of culture and identity, and genocide. And genocide is always perpetrated by the government. There are many stories of pain and suffering, and I know I didn't really talk about these, but there are also ones of resistance, activism, and achievement. So coming back to Plymouth, we must make room at the table. So this is Thanksgiving in Plymouth, Day of Mourning. And we must widen and redefine the meaning of Thanksgiving. We cannot bury the past. It will lie in the ground like radioactive waste. It will never die. And I'd like to close, I'd like to say a couple words before I bring Lloyd back about another famous war, King Phillips War, that happened. It was the costliest war for white people in the history of the country. It outdid the Civil War. And one of the reasons is there weren't as many people back in the 1670s as there were when the Civil War happened in the mid-19th century. But the war broke out around issues of land and loss of culture. So the Initially, there was the Massasoit, whom you saw the big statue of, and Governor Bradford, who was the first governor in Plymouth Colony. And they knew one another, they respected one another, and there was an uneasy peace that was maintained until they died. And they died actually not very far apart. One of the reasons that Massasoit was interested in helping the Pilgrims is because it's the story of germs. Almost 50% of his tribe had been recently wiped out by smallpox. And so he was in a weakened condition, and he was worried about being vulnerable to his enemies. His enemies being the colonial settlers? No, other Indian tribes. And so he was ready and eager to accept these people. Now, they wouldn't have made it through the first winter had it not been for Massasoit and his tribe helping them. And then they taught them about corn and how to plant corn and where to hunt for the deer and how to fish and all of these things. And they were in and among one another. And then eventually, more white people come. There's more greed and demand for the land. There is, along with the numbers that come in, there is now an increasingly unstable stage in their relationship, and the attitude changes. I wouldn't call it actually racist back in the 1600s, but certainly prejudice against the native people and the white people feeling superior. Philip has, this is the last thing I'm going to do. Philip wrote that, we think he said this. It certainly has a sound of authenticity to it. That war, by the way, when that broke out, it almost completely destroyed Massachusetts. They burned village after village after town and got almost to Boston before they were stopped. And the only way that they were really stopped, Philip and the tribes he had allied himself with, was the use of praying Indians who had come into, like Natick, the town of Natick, Massachusetts, was a praying town. It was established to Christianize Indians. And so and they could speak English, and they could also speak the language of the tribes in the area. So the praying Indians reported to Joshua Winslow that the Indians, that Philip was rallying people for an attack. And so when they found out that this praying Indian, this one guy, had probably squealed on them, they killed him. And then 3 indigenous men were put on trial. They had no representation, they weren't allowed to speak, and they were found to be guilty and hung. And so the war is going to break out in that kind of crazy environment of highlighted tensions that had been kept at bay while Massasoit and Governor Bradford were alive. Philip says, the English who first came to this country were but a handful of people, forlorn, poor, and distressed. My father, Massasoit, my father was then sachem, which is chief. He relieved their distresses in the most kind and hospitable manner. He gave them land to build and plant upon. He did all in his power to serve them. Others of their countrymen came and joined them, and their numbers rapidly increased. My father's counselors became uneasy and alarmed, lest, as they were possessed of firearms, which was not the case of the Indians, they should finally undertake to give law to the Indians and take from them their country. They therefore advised him, this is true, to destroy them before they should become too strong and it should be too late. My father was also the father of the English. He represented to his counselors and warriors that the English knew many sciences which the Indians did not, that they improved and cultivated the earth and raised cattle and fruits, and that there was sufficient room in the country for both the English and the Indians. His advice prevailed. It was concluded to give food to the English. They flourished and they increased. Experience taught that the advice of my father's counselors was right. By various means, they got possessed of a great part of his territory, but he still remained their friend until he died. Soon after I became sachem, they disarmed all my people. They tried my people by their own laws and assessed damages against them which they could not pay except with their land. But a small part of the dominion of my ancestors remains. I am determined not to live until I have no country. My granddaughter is so taken with Indigenous history. She's 9 years old. She read a story, and now she's wanting to know constantly, what is the real name of that street? What is the real name of that river? What is the real name of Albany? Because she knows that there were names before the names that we assigned them. And I take great hope in that. She's so genuinely interested and excited. You know what, I have to say one thing. You know what's interesting to me? Have you noticed how many streets have Indian, that go into West Hartford near the golf club, and all the streets are names of Indian tribes. And then there's King Philip School, right? And then summer camp. I don't know how many of you went to summer camp, but summer camp is imbued with all of these icons and artifacts of Indians that they now take possession of in little ceremonies in the camps. And they have Indian names for the different cabins. And then what about the Indian princesses, where the daughters and their dads get to go camping and stuff? If you start to think about it, it's amazing how, as an act of authority, really, we take Indian names and use them. Oh, there's a development right in Simsbury, I think, called Metacom Heights or something. I just think about that. So I did want to close on a positive note, and that is that the United Nations has now a Department of Economic and Social Affairs for Indigenous people. This is a worldwide initiative. And the rights to lands and territories and resources they have claimed is at the heart of Indigenous people struggles the world over. And many positive developments have been achieved. But despite these achievements, right, there remains a wide gap between formal recognition of these issues and actual implementation of the plan going forward. So I would say to all of you, I think it's incumbent on us to be educated, to stay abreast of these developments, to push where we find that we can push, and to support them in any way you can. And now, finally,
Question from an audience member.
What?
Question. There's a question.
Oh,
Since having children, I've thought of this often. What is the best way to teach them of Thanksgiving and how to celebrate it appropriately? Do you have any resources appropriate for young children to help explain this?
you know what? I will get back to you on this is a question that we got about, thank you for the question. It is a wonderful question. Is what might be ways that we could, with our families, celebrate Thanksgiving in ways that respect this history? Are there resources that I know of that would be helpful for that? I will find out. And I do know that there are some books that have been written for children. This isn't about, Thanksgiving at the table per se, that teach children about Indigenous people and their respect for the earth and the spiritual nature of their connection with the earth. I think that's one of the things that I would highlight with my children. Yes, I will get back to you. That's a really, really, really good question, especially since we were just doing all the stuff about Thanksgiving in the day of mourning. I mean, I wouldn't do a day of mourning at the Thanksgiving table, but yes, just an awareness of these rich traditions that go back with much longer than us on this continent. So thank you for that question. I'll get back to you. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Lloyd, finally. Let me get my stuff out of here.
Thank you, Carol.
Yes, you're welcome.
Great job, and thank you. And, you know, as we just spoke about the history of Indigenous people, or touched on that, there's so much that they did. They helped to protect, preserve the land, and they took really great care of the land. And so we thank them for that. We're going to now go into Asian American history and touch some more on that for a little bit. So as you can see here, you know, the United States in 1789 had about 865,000 square miles of land. And today that has increased to just over 3.5 million, 3,532 square miles of land. That's how much property the United States has today. And most of its land has been acquired through acquisition, through annexation, and through wars. So today, we're going to continue that conversation on Asian American. And typically, when you hear Asian American, a lot of different cultures has been lumped into that group. Everyone is boxed in. We talk about Chinese, Japanese, Pacific Islanders, Filipinos. We use the term AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islanders. And we use these broad terms, but it's important to know that every one of these cultures are actually very different from each other. And I'll start with Hawaii. How did the U.S. come about to acquire Hawaii? And as you'll see here, that a group of American sugar planters under Sanford Ballard Dole, a name that we're all familiar with, overthrew Queen Liliuokalani, the Hawaiian monarch, and established a new provincial governor with Dole as president. That coup occurred with the foreknowledge of the U.S. Minister of Hawaii, and we also sent Marines to join in protecting this activity. So that's how Hawaii became part of the United States. Guam, in the late 1890s, Guam was a territory of Spain. And what happened was there was war. The Treaty of Paris was signed and formalized. And with this transaction, the U.S. acquired or gained control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the U.S. also paid Spain $20 million for the Philippine Islands. That's about 7,600 islands in that island chain. So when America defeated Spain in the war that was fought, as I said, the Filipinos believed that some 3 centuries of war and colonialization was over. Unfortunately, and what they did, they went about and they formed a constitution. They created their own constitution as an independent nation. But what they eventually found out that they were now under a new colonial government of the United States, because the U.S. had paid Spain $20 million for control of the Philippines. And so you had a number of imperial wars that took place through the years. And through those imperial wars, the U.S. gained control of Guam, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Pacific Islanders, Vietnam, other South Asian countries. And so what we end up having is, I'll jump now to Chinese Americans, because I'm going to try to touch on different groups over the next few minutes. So Chinese Americans came to the United States they started migrating to the United States in larger numbers in around 1948 because there was challenges in China. I think it was the Qing dynasty was in control, and there was a brutal Taiping rebellion which claimed over 20 million lives. So young Chinese decided that they wanted to try their fortunes in the U.S., so they went to the West Coast, and they joined they were part of the gold rush, so they would go prospecting, and many of them would be successful in the prospecting. They would often take over plots that were already been searched for. People had already prospected it and did not find much gold, but they would be able, because of their skill in handling the soil and with water, they would be able to find gold in these old plots. So while they were doing that, things got slow, and at this point you had the Civil War going on. So in the 1860s, the Transcontinental Railroad Act was passed, and as I said, the Civil War was going on at this time, and so they needed a lot of labor on the West Coast. So what was an available source of labor? Chinese laborers. So when we think of the original Transcontinental Railroad, a major portion of the western portion of that was built by Chinese labor. Over 11,000 Chinese workers were involved in that, and unfortunately many died. I mean, they were using dynamite. I mean, the weather was cold at times. Many froze to death. Their payment was low. They were being paid a fraction of what other workers were being paid, but they were working hard, and they were working hard at getting it done. So because the Transcontinental Railroad was something that actually was a dream of many businessmen throughout the years. It had been tried, they had voted on it in Congress, but they were not successful in getting it done. So the idea, because the Civil War was in progress at the time, and the Southern representatives were not in Congress at the time, those who were there were able to get it passed, and so that's how the Transcontinental Railroad Act came to be. At this time, President Abraham Lincoln was able to look towards the future and say, what do we want the U.S. to look like? How do we get there? You had the gold rush where people were trying to get to the West Coast. Building this would allow for commerce, for transportation. So there was a lot of things. And thanks to the Chinese community, the Chinese American community, we were able to get that done. So Congress provided financial incentives for two companies, the Central Pacific Railroad and the Union Pacific Railroad, to build this. And they were well compensated for this project, actually. For each mile of track that was laid in the plains, they were paid about $16,000. As you got higher elevations, they were paid about $48,000 for each mile of track that was placed. And in addition to that, they were given land. So I think for each mile they built, they would get about 10 acres or 10 miles of property. Unfortunately, in many cases, just to follow up with what Carol was just talking about, the land that was given belonged to the Indians. And it was even though treaties may had been passed and they were supposed to be paid for it, the treaties were not honored and they were not paid for it. So here you had the land being used and the real owners of the land not being compensated for it. So the railroad was being built, and it was being built by American laborers and a lot of people coming in and working those fields. So it happened that the railroad was completed and people were now able to travel across the country to continue to develop the West, because this allowed for families to now move easily. What would once take 3 days or three months or 3 weeks to travel from one place to the other, they could get it done in a week. So it really speeded up the process of transportation. Now, as we move forward, we got to the 1850s, and as I said, Chinese labor was important. But as labor becomes important, one of the things we realized is that the Chinese were willing to work for little or nothing. And so oftentimes the landowners or the wealthy owners, wealthy white owners, they would say to the white laborers that, well, I'm not going to pay you that because I can get it cheaper from the Chinese. What that did, that created conflict, that created an animosity towards the Chinese. And so there was events that happened that many Chinese were killed. There's one event called the Snake River Massacre. I won't get into details on that, but that was an ugly incident where some farmers and ranchers attacked some Chinese campers who stole their gold, destroyed them, and just dumped their bodies in the river. So because of what the wealthy landowners were doing, creating this conflict between the working whites and the Chinese laborers, they created an environment for hatred, and also this led to discrimination laws being filed and being passed. For example, in the 1850s, California passed its first anti-Chinese law. And this was a legislation that was a tax only on Chinese miners. In 1854, the California State Supreme Court categorized Chinese with blacks and Indians, denying them the right to testify against white men in a court of law. And then in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. And this really was it barred all Chinese, with a few exceptions, from entering the United States. And this was the first time that the U.S. had banned any group of people from entering the country based purely on their ethnicity. This was the start of some bad things to come. So what were the laws, some of the laws that were passed? There were laws passed that prevented the Chinese from, it says they were not allowed to be citizens. They were not allowed to vote. They could not be in public schools or they could not use the hospitals. They had no representation in Congress. They had special taxes levied against them and very few allies among the white community. They basically had no rights. So what were their options? The 14th Amendment. So as you know, the 14th Amendment was passed by the Senate in 1866 and ratified 2 years later to strengthen protection for formerly enslaved people. So what that amendment said that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. And then it goes on to say, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privilege or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So, using that, the Chinese were able to go to court, and that portion of it that says no person, no state shall enforce any law which shall abridge the privilege or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any persons. As I said earlier, they were not allowed to be citizens. But using the clause, any persons, they were able to use the 14th Amendment to say that as a person, you cannot discriminate against us. And so what that allowed them to do is to bring case after case after case as persons to begin with. And then they were then able to go into the court after that and says, we have Chinese citizens. There are people who came from China and they were born right here in the United States. So the 14th Amendment said, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to its jurisdictions are citizens of the United States. So that allowed them to, again, make cases, and they started to win battles. But winning these battles did not prevent them from experiencing all kinds of racism and discrimination. Especially in San Francisco, there were just a lot of discrimination in San Francisco and the West Coast, where there was laws that were passed that said you had to have a minimum of 500 cubic square feet for every person living in a building. And that was because the Chinese, they would bunk together in these rooming houses. And so what happened is when they passed that law, some of the elders of the community said, okay, don't pay for bail, stay in court, stay in jail. What did that do? It caused the prisons to be overfull. And they had a smart attorney who would then represent them and said, Your Honor, how is it that you're saying that people must have a minimum of 500 cubic square feet, and yet the prisons, the state, the city does not abide by that same rule. So they were able to use the law to point out that there was discrimination, and it was basically discrimination against them just because of their race. So as happened in 1906, we read about the San Francisco earthquake, which caused just fires throughout. I mean, it destroyed almost the entire community. It was a catastrophe, but it was also a stroke of good luck. The fires burnt the immigration records of many Chinese. So at this point, they decide to use their wit and their money to get a leg up on the system. And what they ended up doing, many would go and they would say, I'm an American citizen. And they would get their papers, they would say, I have kids. And this would allow them to go back to China and bring other family members because at this time, because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, the population went from over 120,000 to below 90,000 over a short period of time. Because no one else could come, and if you left the country, you couldn't come back in. And so it was really to deplete that population. So with the earthquake of 1906, what the government during that period created was this place called Angel Island. Angel Island is technically the equivalent of Ellis Island. Angel Island was opened in 1910, but what it really was, it was a symbol of detention, interrogation, and trauma for the Chinese community. So when they would come back with their kids, with their family, they would be taken to Angel Island, they would be interrogated, families would be segregated, and they would be held sometimes for months on end. And so you had this that created this problem for them, and they had to just deal with it. There was not a lot that they could do to fix that. So what happened? December 7, 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and I didn't realize this until I was doing some research, that they also bombed Guam and the Philippines. And what happened is China was at war with Japan at the time. And so because of that, the US suddenly became allies with China. And many Chinese, despite of what they had gone through, they joined the US military to fight with the US, for and with the US. And also, many Japanese also joined the US Army, the US military. However, the Japanese went from being the good Asians to being the bad Asians and considered to be spies. And the Chinese went from being the unwanted bad Asians to being the good Asians. And unfortunately, there were still many laws on the books, including the Chinese Exclusion Law, which prevented them from being citizens. And so what the US government did at that time, they changed the law. The Exclusion Act was repealed in 1943. And so now the Chinese were able to get more rights. What happened next? So we just spoke about the Chinese, the Japanese. We're familiar with, as I said, the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And then, as I said, most Japanese had also settled on the West Coast. Over 120,000 Japanese, 2/3 of which were born in the US, were removed to internment camp. Unfortunately, many of them had a very small window of time to dispose of their property. So if you had a store, if you had a house, you had possessions, some people had as little as 6 days to sell everything. And so many people were taken advantage of, had to sell for little or nothing, and they were taken to the internment camps, which were technically prisons. And it's interesting because this happened to the Japanese because Japan had bombed Pearl Harbor and was at war with the US and its allies, but so was Germany, so was Italy, but you didn't have that same experience that the Italians and the Germans went through, that the Japanese went through. So it's an interesting situation. So why did that happen? So what happened? Some Japanese filed suit, which took as much as 2 years to be heard. And again, the claim was using the 14th Amendment, because only the 14th Amendment said that no persons can be, basically you can't treat one person different from the rest of the community. And so they use the 14th Amendment and also the 5th Amendment for due process, because there was no, as far as I have read, no Japanese was ever tried and convicted for espionage or for spying against the U.S. But there was no due process during this time so that they could be set free or be charged. So none was. So eventually the Supreme Court, agreed with the government that and supported the discrimination being enforced against the Japanese. But when this came back up about a year or two later, they agreed that it was discrimination, and I think it was in the 1980s, President Reagan and Congress passed a law which provided $20,000 per family in reparation to every family that had gone through this process. So what we've seen here is that there's a lot of things that has happened to many different groups of Americans. And I'll say it I said it before, but I'll say it again. America is a great place to live, one of the greatest countries in the world. But we've done some bad things, and we should not forget about it. We must remember it, and we must make sure that we never go back to the place where we do those things again. Because, as a friend of mine said, America, we're better than that. We're not talking about this to dredge up things or to create animosity. You know, as Carol said earlier, if we don't address this, it's like radioactive waste. That will stay there, and eventually it will destroy us. We can't just bury it and say, yeah, it's there, it's under the carpet. And so because I don't see it, it doesn't exist. It exists, and until we address it and deal with it, we'll never be over it. But when we do, we'll become stronger, we'll become better, and we'll find out the angst that we have when we talk about things like this goes away. We'll remember it, we'll know it, but we'll never forget it, and we can become better for it. So I want to thank you all for joining us, and I want to remind you that next week we'll be on Zoom. And so I want to ask you to sign up at the library program website for this event for next Wednesday, same time. Thank you for joining us. We will continue next week, where we'll talk about Hispanic American and other American histories. And we'll also touch upon visualizing institutional and systemic bias. There are people who think that there's no such thing as systemic bias. And so we want to just talk about that and touch on that, and hopefully we'll all have a better understanding of what is not, and how we can continue to grow. Because, as I've said, the purpose of this is to help us to understand where we've been and where we are today, and how we got to where we are today from where we've been, and how the mistakes we've made, and how we can make better choices as we go forward. So again, thank you very much. Have a great evening, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.